8 engineers stood around a prototype worth $290,000, none of them able to make it run. A specialist had flown in from Stuttgart. The launch was 11 hours away. A man in a blue maintenance uniform walked in from the side corridor, stopped beside the car, and listened. After a moment, he put his hand on the hood. Renata Voss came down from the mezzanine. "Take your hand off my car. Get security." He pulled his hand back. "There's something wrong with your engine," he said. "I think I know what it is." Then he turned and walked out. The room watched him go. What none of them knew, not Renata, not the 8 engineers, not the specialist from Stuttgart, was that the man who had just left had designed that engine, every part of it, including the one that was broken. The morning had started the way most of Caden's mornings started, early, quiet, without ceremony. He had signed in at the Kittredge security desk at 6:50 and walked to the mechanical room on the east side of the building, where the facility's industrial air compression system had been waiting on its monthly service. The contract covered 3 hours. He usually finished in 2.5. The Kittredge Technical Center sat on the western edge of Henrico County, a long, low building set back from the road behind a gatehouse and a lot full of vehicles in various states of evaluation. Inside, the main floor smelled like rubber compound and recycled air. The lighting was white, and even, and unsparing. 4 vehicles sat along the far wall. In the center of the floor, under its own dedicated overhead lights, sat the Kittredge Meridian prototype. Caden had walked past it on his way to the mechanical room. He had registered it the way he registered most things, quietly, completely, without appearing to. He worked without music. He had found, in the 4 years since leaving Varix Powertrain Systems, that he preferred the sound of whatever he was doing. Compressors and valves told you things if you paid attention. Most people had stopped paying attention. Caden never had. From 2017 to 2020, he had been the lead powertrain engineer at Varix, a mid-sized firm outside Richmond that built engine platforms for commercial and motorsport applications. He had led the development team for the VX9, a compact, high-output engine block that Varix had spent 3 years refining before licensing it to a Stuttgart-based manufacturer in late 2020. That Stuttgart firm had used the VX9 as the foundation for their flagship automotive line. The flagship was currently sitting in the center of the Kittredge floor, failing to start. Caden had not known this when he arrived. He had known it by 7 minutes after 7, when the sound of the Meridian's engine had carried through the wall of the mechanical room during a pressure gauge swap. He had kept working. He had finished the job, written the service report, and started toward the exit. He stopped at the doorway to the main bay because the engine turned over for the 9th time, and the shudder in it was unmistakable. And there are things a person cannot unknow about their own work, no matter how long they have spent trying to leave it behind. He thought about Jules, brown hair, 9 years old, currently at school in Ashford, where her grandmother lived in the house they had moved into after Dana died. He picked Jules up at 3 o'clock every day, without exception. That was the one fixed point in a schedule he kept deliberately loose. No overtime, no evening calls, nothing that asked more of him than it gave back. Dana had tried to teach him that balance before she died. He had learned it from her absence instead. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at the door. He thought about walking past it. He had walked past things before: a conversation at Varix he should have pushed harder, a meeting he should have attended, a phone call from Dana on a Thursday afternoon in March that he had sent to voicemail because he was in the middle of a pressure tolerance test. He had walked past all of those and would spend the rest of his life knowing it. He stepped through the door. From the mezzanine, Renata Voss watched a man in a maintenance uniform cross her floor without hesitation, and something in the way he moved, the absence of apology, the absence of self-consciousness, made her wait before calling security. Marcus Webb had been awake since 4:30 in the morning. He was a methodical engineer, thorough, documentation-minded, the kind of man who trusted process and verified everything before signing off. He had run the Meridian through 12 diagnostic cycles since 6 o'clock. The OBD system kept flagging the fuel injection rails. He had checked the rails twice. He had checked the fuel delivery system and the injector seating and the pressure regulators. He had called Dr. Alan Prentice at the hotel at 7:15 because Prentice was Stuttgart's technical representative, and if anyone in the building should be able to locate a fault in a Stuttgart-sourced engine, It was the man who had personally signed off on its design. Prentice had been on the floor for 90 minutes and had not found it either. The Meridian launch was at the Richmond Convention Center. Doors opened at 7 that evening. Delivery was required by 4. 8 hours had sounded like sufficient margin when the morning started. Garrett Cole stood near the far wall with his phone in his hand and said nothing about the maintenance deferral he had signed 3 weeks ago. The Meridian had fewer than 400 miles on it at the time. The scheduled review had been listed as precautionary. He had decided the math worked. He was now watching 8 engineers fail to start the car and quietly revising that assessment and keeping the revision entirely to himself. The deferral had felt clean when he signed it. A judgment call, documented, defensible. Launch timelines were real constraints. Precautionary reviews on low-mileage prototypes were routinely deferred across the industry. He had made the same call a dozen times over the years, and nothing had come of it. He had also, 4 years ago, received an email from a Varix engineer flagging a specific fault tendency in the VX9's secondary oil circuit. He had read the email and made a different judgment. He had not thought about that email again until approximately 40 minutes ago. When Marcus Webb first described the Meridian symptoms, Caden set his clipboard on the nearest workbench. Timing chain tensioner, he said. Secondary oil circuit. Pressure's dropping in the auxiliary line. It's not showing on OBD because the sensor sits in the primary circuit, not the secondary. The bay went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has been said. A junior technician near the back made a sound that was almost a laugh and then thought better of it. Garrett Cole looked up from his phone. "You're the maintenance contractor. You're not authorized in this section." He reached for his radio. Renata came down from the mezzanine. She crossed the floor at a measured pace and looked at Caden, the uniform, the work boots, the clipboard on the bench behind him, and made the rapid, practiced evaluation she had been making of people her entire professional life. "Escort him out," she said. Dr. Alan Prentice stood up. "Wait." He said it once, quietly. It was enough. Every person in the room waited. Prentice looked across the car at Caden. "You said secondary oil circuit, not primary." "That's right. Service bulletin. SBDT 4471. "I know that bulletin," Caden said. "I knew about the fault before you wrote it." Prentice turned to Renata. His voice was precise and without theater. "Varix Powertrain Systems, the VX9 engine platform." A pause. "The block in this car." Renata looked from Prentice to the man in the maintenance uniform, and the map she had been using updated itself. It was visible, briefly, in the stillness of her face. "You designed this engine?" "I designed the part that's broken." He glanced at his watch. When he looked back at her, there was no performance in it. "I pick up my daughter at 3 o'clock. Do you want me to fix this, or not?" Renata said yes before Garrett Cole could say anything at all. He opened his mouth. She turned her head 10 degrees in his direction, and he closed it. Marcus Webb pulled the tool cart without being asked. He positioned it beside the car, stepped back to give Caden room, and then stayed close. He did not stay close to supervise. He stayed because he was an engineer who had spent 90 minutes not finding something, and he needed to understand exactly where he had not found it. Caden set his work gloves on the bench. He walked around the front of the Meridian, past the main access points that the entire team had already worked through, and crouched down on the right side of the engine bay next to the alternator bracket. Marcus Webb watched his hands. Caden's hands moved without hesitation. Not fast, not showy, just certain. The certainty of a person who had been to this exact location in their mind many times before, and was now simply confirming what they already knew. Webb had been an engineer for 22 years. He recognized that quality, and he recognized, with the specific discomfort of a competent professional confronting a gap in his own competence, that he had not brought it to this car today. The secondary oil circuit's tensioner assembly sat behind the bracket. It was accessible, but just outside the sightline of anyone approaching from the standard service angle, which was the approach described in Stuttgart's documentation, because Stuttgart had adopted Varix's original service documentation when they purchased the VX9 platform and had not incorporated the amendment that Varix had proposed. Add the auxiliary tensioner to the pre-delivery inspection sequence. Stuttgart had received that proposal. It had been reviewed and not acted on. The car on the floor was the result. Caden lay down on the epoxy surface. He worked by feel past the bracket, found the tensioner housing, and removed it with a 14mm and a flathead that Webb passed to him without being asked. He held the assembly up under the overhead light. The check valve responsible for maintaining auxiliary oil pressure during cold starts was partially seized. Factory residue, common on low-mileage test units, run in repeated short cycles. He cleared the obstruction, verified the valve seat, reinstalled the assembly, and torqued it by hand. He stood up. "Start it," he said. Webb got into the driver's seat. The engine climbed. It held. The idle settled into something clean and even, and at 40 seconds, the point where every previous start had broken down, it did not break. 60 seconds. 90. 4 minutes and 21 seconds, start to finish. Webb looked at the OBD screen. No fault codes. Clean on every channel. He sat in the driver's seat without speaking. Dr. Prentice crossed the floor to where Caden was folding the rag from his back pocket. He spoke quietly, under the sound of the running engine. "Stuttgart should have listened to you in 2020. They're listening now," Caden said. He picked up his clipboard from the bench. Renata Voss stood 3 meters away with the engine running behind her. She was watching a man in a maintenance uniform pick up a piece of paper, and she was thinking about her own voice from 20 minutes ago, and the particular tone she had used, and there was nothing in her that could cross the distance between those two moments cleanly. Caden walked to the side door. It was still open the way he had found it. 30 seconds later, Garrett Cole left the room. He moved quickly, phone already out, and shouldered through the corridor door without looking back. Renata watched him go. She did not go after Garrett Cole immediately. She had learned, over a decade of running a company, that the first move after a crisis tells you more about the people in the room than everything that came before it, and she was not finished reading the room. She went to Marcus Webb and asked, in a level voice, why the auxiliary tensioner assembly was absent from their pre-delivery checklist. He explained the checklist derived from Stuttgart's service documentation, and the component was not listed. She asked to see the documentation. He showed her. She asked for the full VX9 acquisition correspondence, not the board summary, but the complete email record. Webb didn't have it. That file lived with Garrett. She found Garrett in the back conference room. He had had enough time to prepare something, which was always the condition under which he was most dangerous. He led with liability. A non-credentialed contractor had performed unsanctioned work on proprietary hardware. The legal exposure was material. He had been acting to protect the company's interests. He delivered it with the measured concern he had always been good at projecting. Renata let him finish. Then she asked about the maintenance deferral, a pause that told her what she needed to know before he spoke. He said it was a judgment call. Low-mileage vehicle, fixed timeline, precautionary review. "Who else did you consult before signing it?" He said the decision had been made at the operational level. "I want the full acquisition file on my desk by 9 tomorrow. Every email, including the Varix correspondence." She stood, not a summary. That evening, the Meridian launch went exactly as planned. The car rolled into the Richmond Convention Center under its own power, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. Renata stood beside it and shook hands and answered questions and smiled at cameras, because this was also her job and she had always been capable of it. Underneath all of it, she kept seeing the tool cart being moved, the engine settling. 4 minutes and 21 seconds. She had met a lot of engineers over the course of her career. Some of them were technically brilliant and knew it, and used that knowledge the way people use assets, carefully, strategically, with attention to what it earned them. Some of them were technically brilliant and did not particularly care whether anyone else knew, which was rarer and more useful. She had never met one who had been technically brilliant, had been correct at a moment when being correct would have prevented a problem, had been ignored, and had then walked away not to another company, not to a competitor, but to monthly maintenance contracts in Henrico County. She had been thinking about that all evening, underneath everything else. She asked her assistant quietly, at the end of the night, whether anyone had recorded the maintenance contractor's contact details. No one had. She found Ray Okafor's number herself, through the facility's contract file, and called it from the parking garage at 10:45. She sat in the car after she dialed, watching the elevator door across the structure. The Meridian launch had been a success by every external measure. The room had applauded. The journalists had photographed. The car had moved under its own power and held its idle, and done everything a flagship was supposed to do at its public debut. The coverage would be good. The orders would follow. She was thinking about a man in a maintenance uniform who had picked up a clipboard and walked out through a side door, and about the particular quality of the silence in the room after he left 8 engineers and 1 CEO, all of them standing in the wake of 4 minutes and 21 seconds. None of them saying anything out loud about what it meant. She had been in the business long enough to know that most people who were right about something wanted you to know they were right. They wanted acknowledgement, credit, the record corrected. Caden Merritt had folded a rag, picked up a piece of paper, and walked out to go get his daughter from school. She did not know what to do with that yet. Ray Okafor picked up on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting the call. He confirmed the name and the contract. Monthly service, air compression system, 14 months running, always finished early, never a complaint. Then, before she could ask anything else, he said, "He doesn't talk about the engineering, Varix, the VX9, none of it. I want you to know that going in, I'm not asking you to tell me what he'd want kept private. That's a harder position to hold than it sounds," Ray said. "People think they're asking about background. They're usually asking about a person." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did he leave Varix?" Ray took his time. "That's his to say." A pause. "What I'll tell you is that he's not hiding from anything. He looked at his life and decided what mattered, and then he built his days around that. The drive to Ashford. 3 o'clock. The girl." He paused again. He didn't stumble into a smaller life. He chose it. She thanked him and sat in the car after hanging up, engine off, the parking structure quiet around her. The acquisition file arrived at 8:47 the next morning. She read it before her coffee cooled. The Varix thread was near the bottom 6 emails, the first from a sender whose signature read C. Merritt, Senior Powertrain Engineer, Varix Systems. The email laid out a specific fault tendency in the VX9's secondary oil circuit. The auxiliary tensioner's check valve seizing under repeated short-cycle cold start conditions. Supporting data was attached. Merritt had proposed a checklist amendment and requested a 60-day delay on the platform transfer to allow for a targeted component update. Stuttgart had acknowledged receipt 3 days later. Their reply thanked Varix for the note and said the matter was under internal review. There was no further Stuttgart reply in the chain. There was, however, a forwarding record. The Merritt email had been forwarded internally to Garrett Cole the day it arrived. Below the system notation was a single line in Garrett's own hand, flagging for ref-likely positioning on price. He had read it. He had made a judgment. He had not sent it to Marcus Webb or to anyone on the technical team. Renata closed the laptop. She sat at her desk for a long time, which was not something she usually allowed. Then she drove to Ashford. She drove the 40 minutes without the radio. She had spent her entire career making decisions quickly, because the cost of hesitation was usually higher than the cost of being wrong. You could correct wrong. You could not recover time. She had made a decision in 20 seconds on Tuesday morning, and it had been the wrong one. And the man she had been wrong about had corrected it in 4 minutes and 21 seconds without making her feel it, which was either grace or the indifference of someone who had stopped needing to be acknowledged. She was not sure which one was more unsettling. The Varix correspondence sat on the screen of her laptop in the passenger seat, locked and asleep. She did not need to read it again. She had the sequence memorized already. The email, the data, the 60-day request, the forwarding notation, Garrett's single line of assessment. The gap between what Caden had written and what Garrett had done with it was not ambiguous. It was a clear record of a decision, made by a specific person, with specific consequences, and all 3 of those things were now documented and irrefutable. She found him at a small equipment repair shop on the south end of town. The owner pointed her around the side of the building. Caden was on one knee beside a compressor housing when she came around the corner, working a corroded fitting free with channel lock pliers. He heard her on the gravel and looked up. His expression registered her and waited, the same way it had in the bay. "Ray called," he said. "I thought he might." She stopped a few feet away. I read the acquisition file. The November 2020 thread. He set the pliers down. "Garrett Cole received your email the day you sent it," she said. "He classified it as a negotiating tactic. He didn't pass it to engineering." "I know. You knew it was him?" "I didn't know his name specifically. I knew someone had read it. and decided it wasn't technical. He picked up the pliers. The service bulletin came out 10 months later. That was enough. A truck passed on the road out front. The sound faded, and the lot went quiet again. "I want to bring you in as a technical consultant," Renata said. "A full review of our pre-delivery inspection protocol Meridian line first, then everything else in the facility. 4 to 6 weeks. I'm not asking you to drop your existing clients." Caden turned the fitting another quarter rotation. He didn't answer right away. She waited. "Why me specifically?" "Because you're the only person in that room who looked at the right place." "I looked at the right place because I designed it." He glanced at her. "You also told a guard to remove me before you knew any of that." "I know." He held her gaze for a moment. She gave him the acknowledgement without dressing it up. Footsteps on gravel, quick and light, coming from the street side of the building. Jules came around the corner still wearing her backpack, ponytail half loose the way it always was by afternoon. She stopped when she saw Renata, looked at her father, recalibrated. "Is this the car lady?" "It is," Caden said. Jules turned to Renata with the direct, undisguised attention of someone who had not yet learned to look sideways at people. "Is the car working okay now?" "It is," Renata said. "Your dad fixed it." Jules considered this as though reviewing a report. "He's good at that," she said, walked past both of them, and went into the shop. Something crossed Caden's face while he watched her go. It was there and gone. He looked back at Renata. "I'll think about it," he said. Renata nodded. She turned toward the street side of the lot. She was almost to her car when he said, "The email." She stopped and looked back. It wasn't only about the tensioner. He was still beside the compressor housing, pliers in hand. "I'd been trying to get that amendment into the pre-delivery checklist for 8 months before Stuttgart came into the picture. Nobody at Varix thought it was urgent enough to prioritize. When Stuttgart bought the platform and I sent the email, I already knew the odds." He paused. "I left because I'd spent 3 years building something I was proud of, and when it mattered most, no one in the chain wanted to hear it. And then Dana died." He looked at the housing in front of him. "After that, I just didn't have enough left to keep trying to make people listen." Renata stood on the gravel. There was nothing she could say that would be proportionate to that, so she said nothing. The street was quiet. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. After a moment she said, "Monday. The documentation. I'll call you," he said. She drove back to Richmond with the radio still off. She passed the exit for Henrico County at 65 miles an hour and thought about 4 years of 3 o'clock pickups and monthly maintenance contracts, and thought about what it would take to build a life around a single fixed point and mean it not as a phase, not as recovery, but as the actual shape of the life you intended. She did not have an answer for that. She was not sure she was meant to. The article ran the following morning, 3 paragraphs on a Richmond area news site, an anonymous industry source, framed around liability. A non-credentialed contractor had performed unsanctioned technical work on a Kittredge prototype. The piece named Caden Merritt, linked his name to Varix Powertrain, and referenced a 2019 industry profile that someone had surfaced from an engineering trade publication. Ray texted Caden at 6:48. "Heads up." He read the article at the kitchen table. Jules was still asleep. He read it once, set the phone face down, and stood at the counter while the coffee finished. When Jules came downstairs, she said his name was on her tablet. He told her it was from something at work. She asked if he was in trouble. He said no. She looked at him, the measured, specific look of a 9-year-old deciding whether to accept an answer, and then poured her cereal and sat down. He drove her to school and waited until she was through the door before he pulled out of the lot. Renata called at 7:15. Garrett sourced the piece. The metadata on a draft puts it at 11:43 Tuesday night. A pause. "I'm handling it." "You don't need to do that for me. He used the company's name to do it. That makes it mine." Another pause, different in quality. "How is your daughter?" Caden looked out the kitchen window, at the oak at the edge of the lot, still bare. "She saw it this morning. Asked me if I was in trouble." A silence, not the silence of someone who didn't understand. "What did you tell her?" Renata asked. "That I wasn't. That stays true," she said. "I'll make sure of it." After she hung up, he sat at the table with the cold coffee. He thought about Jules's face at breakfast, the brief, careful calculation behind her eyes, before she decided to let the answer stand. She was 9 years old, and she was already learning that some things had to be taken on faith. He drank the cold coffee. Then he got up and started the day. He had 2 jobs on the schedule. The first was a routine filter replacement at a printing facility in Mechanicsville, 2 hours. Straightforward. The second was a pressure system calibration at a cold storage warehouse in Short Pump that had been giving irregular readings for a month. He did both in sequence, drove home, and ate lunch at the kitchen table where he had read the article that morning. He thought about the piece, the way it had framed things, the way his name had appeared in it. He understood what Garrett Cole had been trying to accomplish. The logic was not difficult. Create a liability narrative, recast Caden as the risk, give Renata a reason to stop asking questions about the deferral. It was the move of a man who understood that offense was sometimes the only viable defense. What Garrett had miscalculated was that the story required Renata to believe Caden was a threat, and Renata Voss had stood in a room and watched Caden fix in 4 minutes something her team had not been able to locate in 2 hours. The story could not survive that fact, and a version of Renata that Garrett's calculation depended on one who would prioritize liability cover over what she had seen with her own eyes was not the person Caden had met on Tuesday morning. He did not know her well enough to be certain of this, but he had watched her face when the engine held its idle, and he had watched what she did not say in the seconds after, and he thought he had a reasonable read. He washed his lunch dishes and called the Short Pump client back about a follow-up visit. The board meeting was not on the calendar. Renata sent the notification at 8 the previous night. All 7 members were seated by 9 in the morning, because when Renata Voss called an emergency session, the members of the Kittredge board did not find conflicts. She presented the acquisition file in sequence, without editorializing. The Varix correspondence. The November 2020 email and its attached technical data. The proposed checklist amendment. The 60-day delay request. Garrett Cole's forwarding notation on the same day. The email arrived, times flagging for ref likely positioning on price times with the read receipt confirming he had opened it. The maintenance deferral he had signed 3 weeks before the launch, unilaterally, without notifying engineering or filing a risk assessment. She put the numbers on the screen. Projected cost exposure for a post-launch recall on the Meridian line if the fault had not been found before delivery. The room knew how to read numbers. Garrett said the press contact had been a reaction, not a strategy, and he understood how it appeared. He said the email assessment had been a judgment call made under commercial pressure. He said the deferral was standard operational practice. He was not wrong that it had been standard, in the sense that the industry norm for precautionary reviews on low-mileage prototypes was genuinely inconsistent. He was not wrong that the Varix email had arrived during a period of active commercial negotiation, and that distinguishing technical concern from negotiating tactic was a real skill that not everyone in a procurement role possessed. He made these points clearly and without panic, because Garrett Cole had always been good under pressure, which was a large part of why he had the job he was now at risk of losing. None of it changed the sequence of events on the screen. Renata said, "What I'm asking the board to consider is whether the person responsible for these decisions should continue in this role while a full review is conducted." The vote took 11 minutes. Garrett Cole left his badge on the table. He walked out without speaking to anyone, and no one in the room watched him go with anything that resembled surprise. Marcus Webb came to Renata's office an hour later. He stood in the doorway and said he was formally requesting an external audit of all inspection documentation in the facility, not just the Meridian line. He said he had missed something that should have been findable, and he intended to understand every other place a similar gap might exist. "I'll arrange it," Renata said. She called the journalist that afternoon and provided the full account who Caden was, why he had been in the building, what had actually generated the liability exposure the article had claimed to be concerned about. She did not request a retraction. She gave the journalist the facts and let her decide. The follow-up piece ran 2 days later. It named Garrett Cole. It was substantially longer than the original. That evening, Renata sat in her car in the parking garage for a while before she drove home. She thought about the vote. She thought about Marcus Webb in her doorway, the way he had stood there and asked for the audit without being prompted, without hedging, without framing it as anything other than what it was. She had been running Kittredge for 4 years, and she had learned in that time that the quality of an organization showed up most clearly in how people behaved immediately after something went wrong. Marcus Webb had behaved well. She would remember that. She thought about the kitchen table in Ashford, and a 9-year-old girl deciding to take her father's word on faith, and she thought about the fact that some people had to take things on faith because they had not been given enough information to make any other choice, and she thought about who had been responsible for that. Her phone lit up. Unknown number. Jules wants to know if she can see the Meridian engine. Says she has questions. See? She read it twice. She looked at the parking garage ceiling for a moment. Then she typed, Saturday morning. I'll arrange access. She started the car and drove home. The Saturday visit was logged as a facilities tour, 1 minor, 1 adult guardian, escorted access. Official enough to be on record, informal enough to require only Renata's sign-off. She was waiting in the lobby. When they came through the glass doors, Jules arrived first, backpack on, wearing a jacket with a small embroidered patch on the left sleeve, a B, neatly stitched, that Renata would learn later Dana had sewn on the year Jules started 2nd grade. Caden came in behind her with his hands in his jacket pockets, and for a moment the three of them stood in the lobby, and the space settled around them without any of them deciding how. Jules looked around the lobby with the attentive, unhurried survey of someone taking in a new environment they intend to understand. She clocked the security desk, the elevator bank, the glass wall that looked out onto the main floor. She did not appear nervous. She appeared interested, which were not the same thing and were not equally common in 9-year-olds standing in the headquarters lobby of a company they had never visited. Renata had arranged for the floor to be quieter than usual. 2 of the standard staff were out for the morning. The remaining technicians knew the visit was happening and had been characteristically unbothered by it. Webb had told them a kid was coming to see the engine, and they had treated this as a normal occurrence, which Renata appreciated. Marcus Webb had agreed to lead the tour without hesitation. He had printed a schematic and brought it rolled under his arm. Jules moved around the Meridian the way her father had moved around it on Tuesday, with direction, not hesitation. She asked about the cooling system. Webb answered. She asked about compression ratio. He answered. She asked about the secondary oil circuit, and Webb glanced at Caden across the car hood. Caden gave a small shrug. It meant, go ahead. Webb told her all of it. The auxiliary tensioner, the check valve, the cold start pressure behavior, the reason the diagnostic system had missed it. He explained it without stripping the detail away, because after the first 3 minutes it was clear that Jules did not need things made simpler. When he finished, Jules looked at her father. You knew all that just from hearing it? I knew what to listen for, Caden said, because you built it, because I knew where the problem was likely to be. That's the same thing, Jules said, with the definitive quality of someone who has just resolved something, and went back to examining the engine. Renata had moved to stand beside Caden at some point during the explanation. She had done it without deciding to the way positions shift during a long conversation. When no one is tracking the map, she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. She's going to be an engineer, Renata said. She'll be whatever she decides. He watched Jules hold the schematic up against the actual hardware, comparing. But probably, yeah. A pause. The bay was quiet around Webb's patient answers to Jules's follow-up questions. The consulting work, Caden said. I've been thinking about it, and I want to see the full inspection documentation before I start. Everything your team uses, and everything from Stuttgart. He paused. If there's more in there that got missed, I want to find it before it leaves the building. I'll have it ready Monday, and I keep my existing contracts. I told you you would. He looked at her. A pause that was not quite a question and not quite a decision, but held something of both, and she let it hold without filling it. Okay, he said. Across the bay, Jules had set the schematic on the workbench and was pointing directly at a component on the engine, asking Marcus Webb something that was going to take him a moment to answer well. Her voice carried in the large, quiet space, clear and specific and entirely at ease, with not knowing yet, which was its own kind of confidence. Caden watched her. He didn't say anything. Renata watched him, and thought about a doorway and a voice that had said escort him out, and thought about an engine holding its idle for the first time in a week, and thought about a girl at a kitchen table deciding that her father's word was enough. She had spent years knowing exactly which questions to ask. She just hadn't known, until now, which room to ask them in.